Let's talk about a little more of a comic-y aspect of writing comics, and that's the idea of writing pictures, and more specifically, the kind of differences between writing a comic compared to writing anything else. I think the main difference is the idea of writing pictures, and sort of like writing static pictures. So, in a previous video, I talked about writing scripts, and in it I said that thinking out composition for your pages isn't required for script writing. In fact, I said ignore it for the most part, and that still holds true for the most part. That doesn't mean that there is no consideration for the images that are going to go along with your dialogue, otherwise you wouldn't write a script at all. When it comes to writing a comic script, it's a good idea to understand how comics work and the ways that pictures are used to get things across. It may sound like the most obvious duh thing in the world, but when you are writing a comic script, you're writing for a comic. You aren't writing a movie, a novel, or a play. There are transferable skills and tips, and I highly recommend you learn from both. As you can tell, I clearly learned from both. However, they're different, and there are two common sorts of directions I see when it comes to writing scripts without fully thinking them as comics, and thinking of them as something else as a starting point. So one way is kind of thinking of them as you would a novel, and another way is thinking of them more like you would an animation project. I say animation because a lot of comic creators do both occasionally, or at least very familiar with both, or enjoy both. So either way, let's start focusing on what doesn't translate well between novels and comics. In this case, it's usually caused by someone starting from the point of being a novel writer, a prose writer, and not really an artist themselves. In this case, the struggle shows in a tendency not to think visually. Obviously, this isn't the case for all writers, but the tendency to write without considering the visual nature of comics is very much present in most of these cases. Often you get away without thinking about blocking and setting and where characters are and what they look like in prose. In fact, I think if you think too much about this stuff, I'd encourage you not to do it so much while you're writing a novel. Think a little more about internal senses, more difficult senses to portray visually, like touch, smell, thoughts, But when you're then going over to comic scripts, you definitely need to think more visually. Like when it comes to modeling your scenes and you're writing a comic, decide how you want this information to be delivered. You need to take into consideration what things are going to look like, where people are standing in relation to each other, so that you don't write something impossible to draw, and take some consideration into how you want to communicate things, especially if you're someone who's going to be dividing up panels by yourself in your script phase. I've participated in some of the debate over the rules of film and whether or not they should be followed when doing comics, and I've gone back and forth on it, but for the most part, I'd say follow film language rules unless you have a good reason not to do it. Sometimes the comic flow is going to take precedence, and sometimes, there are differences, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And like I said, you don't need to describe shot for shot, but, there are some key things to consider and bring in from film, especially if you're someone who doesn't think visually. One thing would be to make a point of adding establishing shots. You don't always need one, but for the most part, if you're in a new scene with a new arrangement of people, a new time of day, just any time that the scene, the setting has switched up in any way, make a point of adding an establishing shot. Things can be happening during your establishing shot, or it can just be what it is, an establishing shot. It's very important for people to get a sense of what is going on in a scene before you go too deep into it. Either way, add them. In the same vein, think about close-up shots too. If something is important and would require a close-up, use a close-up, and make a point of it in your script. Well, you don't need to be an artist to be a writer. I mean, unless you consider writing an art, which I guess, if you don't have to be a visual artist to be a writer, but if you're writing comics, learn anyways. Understand visual language and understand what different shot compositions mean, different camera angles, and make note of it in your script. And think about what your scene will look like. Think about the weather, the time of day, the scene, what is going to happen in the scene, and how you can mold these to create something that will be visually interesting, or at the very least gives your artist something to work with. And challenge yourself to write less narration and dialogue, and write in visuals that tell your story instead. And also just think about like what your accompanying visuals are going to be. And that kind of leads me all into my next half. This is for all of you art-focused people, right? Comics aren't animated for the most part. I know there are animated comics, but for the most part, your typical comic isn't animated. Ursula did a great video earlier about how to imply movement, and sort of when you're writing a comic, this needs to be taken into account. For animation types among us, it can be very easy to neglect the static nature of comics. Time behaves very differently in comics. Unlike in an animation where everything is usually moving at the same rate, a frame rate, as it were, comics have an erratic pace. Panels have different sizing. There's a whole breakdown on how that can work. I'm not sure if Ursula's going to do a video on that. I hope she does. Anyways, the time between panels can imply milliseconds, or it can imply millennia. Like panels themselves as well can also contain not just a single second of time, but multiple minutes, especially through action line, through ghosted images. It's not just a single second in every panel, and you need to take that into consideration. You don't need to include everything in your panel. You don't need every single movement. It's not an animation, it's a comic, okay? And you need to be very purposeful in what you pick. And when you're writing, doesn't mean you have to describe everything to the letter, but if you do describe something, it better be important. Think about whether you gain anything from switching between shots of your characters. Is that going to make it more interesting? Do their emotions even change? If it's two characters talking together and their emotions don't change much, sometimes it's just fine to just have the two of them in a panel together and have the dialogue exchange happening between them, You just need to consider this stuff and consider the workload you create for yourself when you add kind of unnecessary little bits in between, and just how it can kind of make pages boring if you have tons and tons of talking scenes where not much else is happening. You got to set yourself up for visual success here. And some very important, very quick examples that I think apply honestly to they apply to me so hard, but I always write that characters shake their head, nod, or they sigh, or they take a breath. Sighing and taking a breath is by far my worst attribute. Unless it is important, you don't have to have your characters sigh and eye roll at everything. Everyone has their tells. Every single writer has this default action that they make their characters do. You don't always need it, and you should go back and make note of your tells. Cut them down to which ones actually matter and which ones accentuate a scene. Nodding and head shaking, use them sparingly too, because they usually they're harder to get across than just saying yes or no or huh or yeah. And so I'd rather do that, and the yes, yeah kind of thing tends to be a lot more clear to your reader about what's saying, and you can more easily get right into the detail of the scene. So just be careful of those micro movements that you choose, and whether or not you're choosing them for a reason, or if you're kind of just getting bored of your character sitting around and you want them to do something. So instead of them just saying something, you want them to, do some sort of emotion or emote. It's sometimes better to just write, instead of they sighed, or just say they're angry in your description, or they're getting tired with this. And sometimes it's really hard to decide what everyone's doing, and you go back and you do it later. But think visually, think about how things are going to look. And I think that's all I have for today. We're halfway through the 9-point Kickstarter, and we need $1,600 more to reach the 50% of our goal. I still think we can do it, but we just need to shout it from the rooftops more. So if you want to see this book come to life, please feel free to share and support if you can. Thank you guys for watching. I'm really tired today because I couldn't sleep yesterday, and I did not catch up on my sleep deficit. And it's really hot. Man, it's so hot. Why are these heat waves? Why? I know why. I don't want to look at problems. Okay. Anyways, goodbye.